Hi everyone, my name is Amy. Welcome to my channel. Today I want to talk about the first 25 books that I read in 2022, from the beginning of January up to almost the end of April. 25 books in 4 months for me is a pretty big deal. There was a period of time between like 2017 to the beginning of 2021 where I wasn't reading hardly at all. I would only read like 10 to 15 books a year. And in previous years, like right after graduating from college, I had read 40 to 60 books a year. The middle of 2021, I kind of like found myself again in a lot of ways. And in one of those ways, I started reading again, and I'm a lot happier because of it. To break down the books that I've read so far this year, this is the stack of the 9 out of 10 that I've read in physical copy. I lent my mom the other one, so I don't have it. I've also read 10 ebooks and 5 audiobooks. Multiples of 5, I love how that breaks down. I've read 10 nonfiction books, 1 contemporary, like general fiction thing, 1 romance, and 13 sci-fi / horror / thriller / mystery things. A lot of those books are like a combination of a bunch of different genres, so I just put them together in one category. So I'm gonna talk about all of the books, and I'm gonna rank them from the one that I enjoyed the least to the most, and I'm gonna indicate how I rank them on the Goodreads scale of 1 star to 5 stars. The worst book that I've read so far this year is a memoir called Pathological. It's about this author's experience with the mental health care system in the United States and how over a period of like 3 decades she was misdiagnosed with 6 different mental illnesses. It intrigues me because I'm somebody who both like personally and professionally have seen the problems with our mental health care system. And I acknowledge that psychiatrists and therapists will often get stuff wrong, especially the first time around. And I also acknowledge that some people may not identify with their diagnosis and prefer to identify as something else, something like I'm mentally ill instead of I have bipolar disorder or I have depression. And that's fine, but this book takes it farther than that. She argues that all DSM diagnoses are crap, other than dementia and some certain genetic disorders, that they serve no purpose, and that the diagnoses are not based on science. And I wrote a scathing, long 1.5 star review on Goodreads, and I'll link it down below. Based on the number of likes that it's gotten, I think that I've convinced a lot of people to not read this book. Long explanation short, in the medical community, diagnoses of all types, not just mental illness, are often controversial. A lot of them are a little bit arbitrary and difficult, and guidelines for diagnoses are changing all the time in many different medical fields. You don't have to have an organic illness to have an illness, or an illness with organic evidence, physical evidence, something that you can see on an x-ray. Anybody who has things like migraines, fibromyalgia, long COVID will tell you that. Anyway, enough of that crap. We're gonna move on to the 2 stars now. The second worst book that I have read in 2022 is The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks. I read this for another video, so I'm not gonna elaborate beyond that. This is really badly written and really boring. Just watch the movie. 2.5 stars now. My third least favorite book is called The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkauf. This is a thriller about an author who's writing alone in a house during a really bad snowstorm. She finds a little kid in the snow after what has seemed to have been some kind of horrible accident or crime, and she has to figure out what the hell is going on, and there are flashbacks and different point of views, and it was fine. I listened to the audiobook. It just really didn't grab me. I can see how it might be somebody else's thing, but I kind of figured out what was going on pretty early, and I I just didn't really care for it. That's actually it for the 2 stars. Everything else was 3 or more stars, which is good. Ice by Anna Kavan. This is a book that's very difficult to explain. People have been trying to explain this book and figure out what the hell this book is about for decades. It's, I think, like 50 years old. It's hard even to say what it's about because there isn't really a plot, but vaguely it's about this man who is living in this post-apocalyptic, icy world, and he's obsessed with this woman who is like blonde, ethereal, and also looks icy. It was interesting. My issue was not really the book, it was me. I got the audiobook and that was a mistake. If you're going to read Ice, you need a physical copy. You need a pencil in your hand. You need to be taking notes. You need to do your research on the material, which I did do, but I just feel like I didn't get enough out of the audiobook. I do want to pick up a physical copy one day, and I'm sure that if I do, my rating will be higher. It's sci-fi-ish, it's magical realism, dystopia, as I said, and it's about possibly drug addiction, possibly the Cold War, possibly multiple things. It could also be about nothing and just be like a experimental writing adventure. Let me know if you've read Ice and what you think about it. The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. Yes, I am sad to have this one as far down as it is, but it was fine. It was okay. I actually think I'm kind of struggling with Simone St. James as an author. I think that she's a very, very good storyteller, a very good writer, but her genre is just like not my favorite. She definitely doesn't write thrillers. She is a mystery, a gothic, supernatural mystery writer. That's cool, but I do prefer mysteries and ghost stories to be a little bit more rough around the edges. Her books are kind of predictable, but I do appreciate how good she is at her craft. The Broken Girls is a few years old. It was her first commercially successful novel, and it's about this investigative reporter who is looking into her sister's death and also into this supposedly haunted boarding school. And there's perspectives from the boarding school from the 1950s and then the reporter's present day. Sundial by Katrina Ward. Oh god. So we're going now from an author who I would like a little more from to one who I think could give less sometimes. Sundial is a sci-fi horror thriller. It's got all the genres. Mostly it's a thriller. It's about a mom who is worried about her young daughter. Basically, she's worried that her daughter is a psychopath because she's showing signs of being very unhinged and a little violent. So she removes her daughter from the home and takes her out to the desert. This takes place in California. Very remote property where her dad and stepmom used to do these sketchy experiments on dogs. I would classify Sundial as disturbing literature, which I like. I have a whole stack dedicated to it. My issue with it was really twofold. One is that I didn't care about the characters. And two is that I felt like it was kind of disturbing for disturbing's sake. I don't think it had anything to say. It wasn't giving what I like in disturbing books, which is either really, really good writing, good characters, or good social commentary. Like, I didn't think I got any of that. It was more like a thriller that was just happened to be disturbing. There's nothing literary or like political about it. And like, I guess that can be fine. I mean, I liked Verity, but Verity was also like campy, and this was not campy either. So it was missing something. So like I said, I read 10 nonfiction books so far this year. Mostly, I guess I rate nonfiction based on how well I think it did what it set out to do. Most nonfiction books that I read are obviously on topics that I enjoy. If I don't enjoy the topic, I usually don't finish the book. My nonfiction books are usually 4.5, 5 stars. But this one, The Financial Diet by the ladies at the Financial Diet YouTube channel. Not that I don't think this is a good little book. It just didn't really give me anything that I couldn't get like on the internet, like from their channel. I would still recommend it as like a college graduation gift maybe. And I'm like fairly financially illiterate, so I did learn some things from this book, and it's got cute illustrations. Yeah, 3 or 3.5. And speaking of 3.5, a book that I have definitely settled on 3.5 stars is In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. I feel like that might surprise some people because a lot of people called this book their favorite thriller of 2021. I get it, but it just wasn't completely for me. I really enjoyed like the first 2/3, 3/4 of this book. You're following a girl named Jessica who is attending a reunion at her old college, 10-year reunion, I guess. She's 32, and she really wants to show up and impress. She really wants everybody to be like, oh, Jessica turned out great. Look at all of her accomplishments. She's very obnoxious and not likable, but you're not supposed to like her. That didn't bother me. What I really liked about this book was the setting of the college. Jessica and her friends go to this made-up elite college in the South called Duquette, which obviously it's Duke, really. And they're all in sororities and fraternities, and rush and getting into the best sorority is a huge deal. And I went to the University of Virginia, and I did not participate in Greek life, but I definitely understood the setting. I felt very comfortable. Comfortable is probably the wrong word, but I appreciated the perspective. It seemed very realistic in the way that it portrayed these wealthier, elite, very smart, very like on top of the food chain kids at a southern university that's highly acclaimed. What I didn't like about this book was, again, 2 things. The romance, because I didn't get it at all, didn't connect with that couple at all, and the conclusion. I don't think that the killer's motives make any sense at all. But if you do, then that's fine. It was definitely well written, and I would recommend this one to people who like thrillers, especially if you're into the dark academic thrillers. I'm always going to enjoy a thriller mystery that's about a group of young friends who get into trouble and have secrets than I am like a domestic thriller. And the next book on my list is kind of similar to In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. It's Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins. And I like this one, I think, a tad better. It's also a 3.5, but a 3.5 is good for me for thrillers. Most thrillers that I read only get a 3 because I feel like they've become really formulaic, and while I may enjoy them, especially because they're short, they're never gonna like wow me. Well, not never, but they're very rarely going to wow me. The thing that I feel like Reckless Girls did that other thrillers that I've read recently don't is have a really interesting setting. It takes place on an island in Hawaii, and it's about this girl who is trying to make this relationship work, but it becomes very clear that he's not very trustworthy. From what I understand, it's based off of Death on the Nile, I think, by Agatha Christie. I think it's based on an Agatha Christie. I think it's Death on the Nile. And so she and her boyfriend end up on this island with some other people, and obviously some people die. I thought that it was really fun. I wasn't like wowed by the revelation at the end, but I think a lot of thriller fans would enjoy Reckless Girls. Okay, back to Katrina Ward. I also read The Last House on Needless Street. It was one of the first books that I read, actually listened to on audiobook. I would highly, highly recommend the audiobook for Last House on Needless Street. The audiobook itself gets 5 stars for me. The narrator is incredible. I liked this book a lot more than Sundial, The thing is, I gave this 3.5, but it was one of my most enjoyable reading experiences of the year so far. I had a blast with this book, trying to figure out what was going on. If you're gonna read this, go into it knowing as little as possible. All I'll say is it's a missing / dead child kind of thing, and it's a gothic mystery. It's kind of Shirley Jackson-ish in a way. And there are big twists upon twists. And you have multiple point of views, and one of them is a lesbian religious cat named Olivia. And if that's not what you want from a book, then I don't understand you. I wouldn't be surprised if years from now, the book that I remember the most from 2022 is Last House on Needless Street, just because it's so unique. The reason why I'm only giving this 3.5 stars is because morally, I just kind of feel like I can't give it more than that. If you've read the book, you probably know what I mean. Some of the reveals left me feeling like, ooh, maybe we shouldn't do that in 2022. But that being said, it was bonkers, and mostly it was bonkers in a good way. All right, we're in 4-star territory now. I have a string of nonfiction books to go through quickly. Crib Sheet by Emily Oster. This is a parenting book about early childhood years. I liked it. I didn't like it as much as her first book, Expecting Better, which I'll get to in a second. I've been a preschool teacher and a pediatric nurse, so a lot of this stuff I already knew, and I also feel like as a statistician, this topic is not as interesting as pregnancy. There just aren't as many like interesting controversial studies about early childhood development. Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is about the Radium Girls from the 1920s, the girls who worked in the clock factory where they had to paint the dials with radium, and how many of them ended up with horrible disfiguring diseases and cancers. I definitely recommend this book. I got it in the wrong format though. I got the ebook and I should have gotten the hard copy. There are a lot of names to keep track of in this book, and you're gonna want to be able to flip to that index. It's one that I would love to own one day. Patient Zero by the people who gave us Quackery a few years ago, which is one of my favorite books on weird old-timey medicine. I also got the ebook for Patient Zero because it was available at my library. It would be nice to eventually own a copy of this too, because like Quackery, it has beautiful illustrations. Patient Zero is about diseases and people who supposedly or actually spread them in the human population at one time or another. I learned a little bit from this book, but of course it was full of things that I already knew because I love reading about diseases. A Molecule Away is another medical science nonfiction. It is about brain diseases and how molecular changes can cause horrifying brain conditions like Huntington's and Pick's and Alzheimer's and all that. It's written by a dementia MD. It was interesting. Again, a lot of it was stuff that I already knew, but I'm always down for a good creepy disease neuroscience kind of thing. All right, last nonfiction for now, Overkill by Paul Offit. I really liked this one. Paul Offit is an MD who is mostly known for his role in the pro-vaccine community. He's written a lot of books, and I'm really glad that I discovered him. I'm really looking forward to reading some of his other stuff. Overkill is about medical misconceptions, things like vitamin C can cure the common cold, and mercury cavity fillings are really dangerous, and a lot of the misconceptions in this book, again, I knew about, but there were quite a few in here that I didn't know were misconceptions at all. Like I didn't know they were beliefs that people had, or I knew that it was a misconception, but I didn't know all about the studies for and against and all of that. This is technically nonfiction too, but it's a memoir. Heartberries by Therese Marie Malhote. Probably pronounced her last name wrong, but this is a memoir about trauma and mental illness and growing up with a very dysfunctional family, alcoholic family. This author is a First Nations woman from British Columbia. My friend picked this for our book club, and I'm really glad that she did. I normally would not pick up something like this, or at least nowadays that I wouldn't. I definitely read a lot of stuff like this when I was like 20, 21, 22. But this is great. If you like addiction and mental health memoirs that are like super depressing but beautiful, like if your favorite book when you were 17 was The Bell Jar, if you like Roxane Gay, especially Hunger, I would recommend this. I believe that this author and Roxane Gay are actually colleagues. This is dark though. Lots and lots of trigger warnings for this one. Assaults, child abuse, suicidality, racism, obviously, etc., etc. And a lot of it is kind of stream of consciousness. I think that she wrote quite a bit of it in the psych ward. So don't go into it thinking there's gonna be like a linear plot. Oh, and also it's mostly written in second person to somebody who she's had a relationship with, which is interesting, but I know not everybody likes that. The next book is actually, in a way, similar to Heartberries. This is Rabbits by Benny Kirschenbaum. I talked about this in my Rabbits video. I'll link it at the end of this video. I'm not going to go too much into detail on this because I have already talked about it, but this is a fictional memoir, mostly. It's marketed as fiction. I do think that it is heavily based on the author's real experiences, but it's also about mental illness, specifically severe depression. But it's also funny, like darkly funny. I would also recommend this to people who like psych ward books. Like, it's kind of a funny story, and Girl Interrupted. If it's you, it's you. Check it out if it's you. Okay, The Vegetarian by Han Kang. This is the first book that I read this year. Yeah, it's the very first book that I read this year. And I picked it up because I wanted something that was similar to the books that I enjoyed the most in 2021. One of them being Bunny by Mona Awad. I've seen people compare Bunny to The Vegetarian. I don't think they're really alike that much, but I feel like they definitely do appeal to the same sort of reader. The Vegetarian is actually 3 novellas that are all linked together. They were originally published separately, and they're about this woman who is quiet, kind of regular housewife who just decides one day that she is going to give up meat. And not just meat, she becomes a vegan, which in the mid-2000s in Japan was a really, really radical thing to do. And this book it's a little extreme at times. If I had a physical copy, it would go on the disturbing bookshelf. It's got a lot of body horror, it's got quite a bit of sexual assault, animal cruelty, eating disorders, lots of weird hospital stuff. A lot of people seem to think that it's about nonconformity. I also think it's about oppression towards women. It's about feeling like life has no purpose and maybe you should just quit and become a literal vegetable. This is definitely one that I would love to reread someday and that I would love to own someday. On to another translated work and my first 4.5-star read, Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. I have also talked about this in my Rabbits video. This is a collection of short stories, mostly horror stories, or kind of all horror stories. Different varieties of horror, sci-fi horror, magical realism, fairy tale, like horror, body horror. Basically, if you like horror and you like literary horror, you're gonna love this. This is actually up for the International Booker Prize, which is awesome. I think every story in here is good. I would say that the first 3 or 4 and the last story are the best, in my opinion. But every story is at least a 3.5, if not a 4, on its own. And the main themes in this collection are grief, feminism, and anti-capitalism, which is all good stuff in my book. The Dead Zone by Stephen King. I bet you could probably guess that Stephen King is my favorite author. This isn't all my collection. I have many other copies of Stephen King books, And I think this is like my 21st Stephen King book. So I'm not a completionist yet, but I do plan to be someday in the near future. This is one of his earlier books. I think it's from 1979. And it is about a young man named Johnny Smith who wakes up from a coma, and he has been asleep for 4.5 years. And this is in the 70s, so basically he goes to sleep during the Vietnam War and before Watergate, and he wakes up in a totally different America. You easily could have written this book to take place from like 2018 to 2022. And he also has the ability to tell the future. And it's about what he decides to do and not to do with his gift. This is an interesting one. I know a lot of people rate this as like one of their top 5 favorite Stephen King books. I wouldn't exactly put it there, but it is a very, very good one. It's hard to classify into a single genre. You can really tell that this was a period in King's career when he was really trying to decide what kind of author he wanted to be, or what kind of authors he wanted to be, because we all know, if we've read multiple Stephen King books, that he writes in different genres. It's not just horror. He also writes in the detective mystery genre and in sci-fi. And this is horror, sci-fi, mystery, and it's also like just a good drama. There's a really good love story in here, and I'm not usually one for love stories, especially in Stephen King books. My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. I have been planning on reading this for what feels like a million jillion years, and I finally got to it in February. I decided to read it in February because it has heart in the title. As far as horror is concerned, it's a decent Valentine's Day pick. Stephen Graham Jones endorsed this idea himself on his Twitter. And this is just as great as everybody has said that it is. The thing about Stephen Graham Jones is that if you love him, I think that you're probably gonna love everything that he's ever written or will ever write. If you don't get him, then he's not for you. He is unlike any other author working in this genre. He is an incredible writer, like a genius, I would even say. And he really toes the line between like writing things that are literary and things that are like exciting and fast-paced. And I mean, this book is about a girl who is obsessed with slashers, and in a way this book is a slasher in itself. And think about how hard it is to write a slasher in a book and not a movie. It really, really would help for you to watch some slasher movies before going into this book. You would never watch every single one that's mentioned in here, because a lot of them are small ones from the 80s, from when Stephen Graham Jones was a child. But you should have seen Nightmare on Elm Street, you should have seen Friday the 13th, you should see Texas Chainsaw Massacre before you read this book. And there are also references to horror movies that aren't slashers. So it'll be useful to have a working knowledge of those too. This book is also really slow. I wouldn't actually say that I enjoyed reading it every time that I picked it up, because it's a bit frustrating and kind of meandering, and it's a little like hallucinatory and confusing, and you don't always know what's happening. But I understand why. This book is about trauma. Our main character, she's 18 years old, and she just failed out of high school, and she comes from a poor indigenous family, and she's really, really obsessed with slashers, to the point where I kind of wondered if maybe she was on the autism spectrum. I don't know if Stephen Graham Jones would agree or would entertain that idea, or if it's something else that's caused her to be this way. There's definitely is something, and you are gonna eventually find out what that something is, why she's into slashers. But I also kind of got like a spectrum-y vibe from her. Her name is Jade, and Jade is convinced that there is a killer in her town, and that she is about to be living in a slasher, and that this girl that she met, who is the opposite of her, very pretty, very successful, part of a wealthy family, that this girl is the final girl. That she will be the one who will survive and play the biggest role, other than the killer himself, in this story. So if you're a certain kind of horror fan, definitely check this out. Okay, I'm gonna talk about 5-star reads now. The best nonfiction book that I've read this year is Expecting Better by Emily Oster. She is a statistician, and this book is about pregnancy, and as a statistician, what she did and didn't do during her pregnancy based on what she learned from her own research. In the OBGYN circle, this book is a little bit controversial because she is not a doctor, but I don't think that she needs to be for what she's writing about. The most controversial thing in this book is that she says that it's okay to drink a little bit while you're pregnant, just based on the evidence. Never does she say, don't listen to your doctor. This is just a book about what the evidence has to say about the things that we're told when we're pregnant. Like, should you really not eat sushi? Should you really not eat deli meats? And yeah, should you have an absolute zero policy with alcohol? I personally am not pregnant and have never been pregnant, but I do plan to be in the near future, and I don't know why I decided to read this book this year, but I like medical nonfiction, as you already know. And the first chapter or so of this book is actually about getting pregnant. So if you are planning on being pregnant in the future, even if you're not pregnant yet, I recommend this. And some OBGYNs, actually, a lot of them do recommend this book, I should say that. The one that I might be going to does list this as a book that they recommend that you read during pregnancy. All right, 2 more. A Promised Land by Barack Obama. I read this in February for President's Day and for Black History Month. And yeah, what is there to say? This is a memoir by Barack Obama about his political career up through the first term of his presidency. Obviously, whether or not you would enjoy this book has to do with whether or not you're interested in American politics, specifically progressive and democratic politics. If you are, you should read this, especially if you were a little bit younger during the Obama presidency. I was in high school and college for his presidency, and I remember a lot of this stuff, but I never got like a sophisticated analysis or good understanding of what was actually going on because I was kind of still a kid. I happened to be reading this during the very beginning of the Ukraine conflict, and I feel like I learned a lot about foreign policy from this while I was watching the horrible atrocities that are taking place in Ukraine on my television. And I think that if you're following the Roe versus Wade possible overturning, then this will also help you understand exactly how difficult it is to make big changes in this country, especially when Congress is divided, which it is more so now than we would like. As Democrats, as progressives, as leftists, than we would like. Nobody is perfect. Obama was not a perfect president at all. I don't agree with everything that he's ever done, but reading this book has really made me realize that we were very lucky to have him, and that presidents and politicians in general like him just don't come around that often. He is a lot more charismatic, a lot more broadly appealing, a lot more like intelligent, a lot more left-leaning than the vast majority of politicians that gain success on the federal level. And my favorite fiction book that I have read so far this year, I also read in February. I read The Dead Zone, A Promised Land, and My Heart is a Chainsaw, and Anthem, all entirely or partially in February. It's difficult to describe. This is a book about teenagers, but it's definitely not YA. It is a book about this kid who has been placed in this psych asylum for anxious teenagers in the very near future. It's probably 2023. It hints that it's a 2023 a couple of times. And there is an epidemic of teenagers taking their own lives, probably because of the stress, the political stress that's happening. This book is about how we feel and how we're dealing with the aftermath of the last president, of January 6th, of the pandemic. It is very, very darkly humorous. Most people would not find this funny at all. I would also put this on the disturbing shelf, potentially. There is a lot of assault and obviously suicide. And our characters are children. They're 15, 18 years old. But it's very witty and it's extremely ambitious. I can't even imagine how difficult it must have been for Noah Hawley to pack in so many pop culture references, so many like recent events into a book and what I could imagine was a pretty short period of time. I'm pretty sure he started writing it in 2020, or at least the bulk of it. This is not for everybody at all. I would read this if you don't like that other book called Anthem, if you like dark political thrillers, if you're okay with all those trigger warnings that I just gave, and if you like Kurt Vonnegut, because this book, while in ways unique, is also very unapologetically inspired by Vonnegut. Noah Hawley inserts himself as the author into the narrative a few times. He has a little saying that's kind of like the one in Slaughterhouse-Five. It's very nihilistic, it's dystopian, it is a Vonnegut book for the modern age, basically. But in a way, it's even like a little bit spicier than that, because we have like a Jeffrey Epstein-like character, and that's like not always that fun to read. But I loved it. This is exactly the kind of unique, the kind of weird, transgressive stuff that I enjoy. Technically though, even though I'm putting this at #1 on my list, I did only give it 4.5 stars. Fiction has to do a lot for me to get a 5. The last 5 that I gave was Bunny, and it was the only book that I gave a 5 to out of like the 35 books that I read last year. The problem with this book is that it is going to be dated very, very quickly if it hasn't already been dated. The invasion in Ukraine happened like a few weeks after I finished this book, like maybe the week after, actually. And now, of course, we potentially have Roe v. Wade being overturned, which I'm sure gets mentioned in here because everything gets mentioned in here, but we didn't know for sure that that was a thing that was probably, unfortunately, going to happen. But that being said, maybe in 20 years, this will be like a really interesting piece of political thriller history like The Dead Zone. And if you recognize Noah Hawley's name, he did write another successful book called Before the Fall, but he's also a TV writer. And I feel like this book only could have gotten published by somebody who is already very well respected and has a lot of connections because of how controversial this is going to be for people on both sides of the political spectrum. Well, that's it. There you have it. Those are the first 25 books that I've read in 2022. Thanks for sticking with me. Take a look at one of my other videos. Like and subscribe, and look forward to seeing other videos similar to this one.